And now, please welcome the President of the International Association of Chiefs of Police, Donald DeLuca.
Good morning. It is my privilege to call to order the Critical Issues Forum. Please join me in welcoming our moderator, CBS News correspondent, Jeffrey Pegues.
Good to see you. Thank you. Good morning. President DeLuca, thank you very much. Appreciate you. Appreciate the invite to this IACP event. I'm honored to be here to lead this important discussion on the challenges facing law enforcement in this country. The challenges that you face today are unprecedented. During my 25 years covering law enforcement, first in local news in cities like New York, Miami, Milwaukee, and Baltimore, and now as the Justice and Homeland Security correspondent for the CBS Evening News, I've seen the changes in policing. And in doing research for my book, which is called Black and Blue, which is about the conflict between the Black community and police, I have listened to both sides of this debate. Police officers on the beat, as well as people in these communities. I know how dramatically policing has changed over the last several years. It's been 3 years since the death of Michael Brown sparked protest in Ferguson. There was Eric Garner in Staten Island, Freddie Gray in Baltimore, and several other flashpoints across the country that have really altered the public's perception of policing. And that's what we're going to dive into today with this distinguished list of panelists who will join us on this stage. At the end of the forum, just so you know, we're going to open this up to your questions, and you can submit your questions electronically using any smartphone or handheld device. So to ask a question, go to iacp.cnf.io in your browser window. Then just click on the Ask button. You will be able to submit your question anonymously. So let's get started. I've known Delrish Moss since we were young guys in Miami. I talked to him a few minutes ago. He says he's still a young guy. Back then, he was in Miami as that police department's point man with the media. Never one to shy away from the tough questions and tough jobs. He's been the police chief in Ferguson, Missouri since 2016. He stepped up and took the job when most folks might have wanted to run the other way. Please welcome Chief Delrish Moss. Having covered the Department of Justice over the last 4 years, I know that Vanita Gupta was extremely busy leading the Civil Rights Division until January of this year. The Philly native, Yale and NYU law graduate was counsel with the NAACP and the ACLU before joining DOJ. Right now, she is the president and chief executive officer of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. Please welcome Vanita Gupta. In 2012, Camden, New Jersey was being stamped with the kind of reputation that no city wants, one of America's deadliest cities. The 140-year-old police department was being disbanded, and the surrounding county formed a new department with Chief Scott Thompson leading it. He caught the attention of the CBS Evening News. So I went to Camden and interviewed him about some of the reforms that he had put in place before reform was the thing to do. Please welcome Chief Scott Thompson. In 2006, Richard Stanek was elected sheriff of Hennepin County, Minnesota. It is that state's largest county and includes Minneapolis, where Stanek served as a police officer for 20 years. Sheriff Stanek has worn many hats in his service to his state and community and now faces a growing crisis in the Hennepin County Jail, where they are seeing crisis levels of mental illness among inmates. Please welcome Sheriff Richard Stanek.
Hey, thank you very much.
Last, but certainly not least, Jim Pasco is the senior advisor to the president of the National Fraternal Order of Police. After serving 2 years in the Army, he worked with the Customs Service and then joined the ATF. He held several key positions with the ATF and eventually served as the Bureau's Assistant Director of Congressional and Media Affairs. He is a life member of the IACP and the Fraternal Order of Police. Please welcome Jim Pasco. How are you? Good to see you.
Wow. All right, buddy.
Hey, Rich. Jay.
All right, so let's begin. Thank you. I'm going to put on my reading glasses because I want to start off with the good news. A recent Gallup poll found overall confidence in police has risen slightly in the past 2 years, with 57% of Americans now saying they have a great deal or quite a lot of confidence in law enforcement, which is matching the overall 25-year Gallup trend. But if you look closer at the numbers, according to Gallup, there are troubling signs there. Police already have to deal with low levels of trust among blacks, and a similar situation may be occurring among Hispanics. The lack of confidence among younger Americans, this poll says, could be an omen of a growing loss of respect for police in the future. So when you hear that, Chief Moss, where you have younger generations of Americans lacking confidence in police, how do you reverse that trend?
Well, I think one of the first things that we need to do, and I think police chiefs in this room are no stranger to the concept of community policing, but what does that mean? When we talk about community policing, I would venture to say that if I talk to every chief in here, there'd be a different definition. And one of the things that's critical is actually getting out to people and asking them what their concept of community policing is, what their concept of building relationships with police are. Because, you know, we come up with great programs. We're wonderful at program creation, but if we're not asking the community what they want, if we're not asking people how we can best relate to them, then we're not going to make any inroads. You know, I can tell you all day about how to clean your house, but only you know the intricacies of it. And so we need to actually have more conversations and work with young people to try and figure out what it is they need, what it is they want from us in terms of response.
Well, what is taking so long for police departments to have these types of conversations, Chief Thompson, with the community?
Well, I don't know if it's been taking so long. I think that one of the things that we have seen is that, particularly with the proliferation of cell phones and the viral videos that go forward and that are highlighting the actions of, I mean, you got to remember, we're having thousands and thousands and thousands of positive interactions each and every day, and one or two in remote locations or anywhere can tend to start to influence opinion. And the one thing that we are seeing and that we need to know is that we can't allow that to define us. And people, you know, nothing builds trust like human contact. And it's got to be experiential. So, you know, for us with the youth to make that change in their opinion, we can't allow ourselves to be defined by a Twitter feed or a YouTube clip. And you know, the only way that's going to change their opinion is for us to have positive contact with them. You know, and we right across the river, you know, one of the things that we really try to do with our officers is to ensure that the time that we're interacting with our public is not solely predicated upon moments of enforcement or moments of crisis. Because if that's the lens, if that's the case, it becomes the lens through which we're defined. And having the positive interactions and getting out of the squad car and connecting with the people lets them know that we're there for them and we care for them. And you know, look, I think it's worth noting before I finish talking here for a second is to recognize the Justin Leo, the 31-year-old officer from Jared, Ohio, was just killed in the line of duty 2 days ago. And you know, actions like that, he responded to a call to try to save somebody, and he ended up losing his life in the process. And that we make sure that when we're serving the community, that they know that we're there for them, because unfortunately we see what happens when things can go wrong.
You talk about serving the community. One issue that we wanted to talk about today was depolicing and the so-called Ferguson effect. I've talked to, and doing research for my book, I've talked to rank and file police officers. I've talked to some police union officials who say, yeah, it's happening. It is happening in big cities and small cities. Jim, how do you respond to that?
Well, as you can imagine, I talk to a lot of rank and file officers too from around the country. In fact, I'm fresh from our national conference in Nashville, where this was very topical. And candidly, we don't see it, we don't call it the Ferguson effect so much as we're inclined to call it the Baltimore effect.
The Baltimore effect.
Baltimore effect.
What's wrong with calling it the Ferguson effect? That was something that James Comey said, right?
Well, James Comey has probably spoken with far less rank and file police officers than you or I have. I think that he was expressing a personal opinion, which he's entitled to do, but as a law enforcement leader, should do it from a more informed perspective.
So you call it the Baltimore effect?
Yes, and the reason for that is simple. The thinking here is that police officers don't fear a confrontation on the street. They fear the adverse consequences should that confrontation go wrong or go bad or be perceived as having gone bad by the public. And then getting, you know, finding themselves in a court situation and from, again, their perspective, not having the backing of the administration that set them out to do what they were doing. And, you know, one of the fastest growing products within the FOP is our legal defense plan. Because, and that's an indicator, and which has always been there, or for the last 20 years or so has been there, but it's been, you know, just a nice to have, but not that many people had it. Well, now everybody wants to have it because there's a general fear that the consequence of their action, again, given the ubiquity of cell phones and social media of various kinds, and the degree to which, from, again, their perspective, that data is being misused or misinterpreted is going to reflect unfavorably on the actions that they took.
So you acknowledge that police are slowing down in some instances?
I think...
Not being proactive?
I think the idea that they're not being proactive is to a degree rebutted by the number of unprovoked assaults on police officers out there doing their jobs. You know, that number continues to increase. The animosity towards police who are doing patrols in tough areas of tough cities is not down, and their visibility is not down. And again, the witness to that is the degree to which they find themselves as targets. But I think the reluctance to go beyond the perfunctory steps that they need to take in a suspicious situation is probably down, yes.
Vanita, while you were at DOJ, 25 or so pattern or practice investigations. There are people that I've talked to in law enforcement who feel that there was a rush to judgment on the part of the Obama Justice Department, Holder, Lynch Justice Department. How do you respond to that when you hear that, there is this idea, well, we have to reach out to the community, but in the same breath, there is this reality that some police officers are reluctant to go the extra mile because they're concerned about that viral video. So how do you respond to that? And how do you respond to the fact that there are a lot of people, perhaps in this audience, who feel like the Obama Justice Department went too far and moved too quickly against police officers?
Well, let me just say, so I was at the Obama Justice Department for the last 2.5 years of that administration, and during my time, I opened 2 pattern and practice investigations in Baltimore and Chicago. And there are, something like 17,000 agencies, and the Justice Department, at the time that I stepped down, had 15 consent decrees. So in the scheme of things, sometimes there's a sense that there is kind of a federalization of policing. Policing is inherently local. And the times that the Justice Department went in through the Pattern and Practice Authority, which was a very judiciously used authority, we got so many more asks and requests, not only from community members, but mayors and sometimes chiefs, that we turned down because we did not feel like it was an appropriate circumstance to do that. In Baltimore and Chicago, I can speak for those, there was pretty much a uniform desire to have the division come in to do a thorough investigation. In fact, and Jim knows this, I met with the FOP in both instances prior to opening both of those investigations. And in Baltimore, for example, the Baltimore FOP had done extensive study of some of the serious issues that they felt they were encountering through some of the policing priorities set by elected officials and others through the past several years in Baltimore that had really, I think, corroded the relationship with certain Baltimore communities and put officers at risk, put public safety in question because victims and witnesses weren't reporting crimes, they weren't calling. I will say, and I stand by those decisions. Our hope was that we would approach those investigations with humility, without a rush to judgment. We closed 6 investigations without ever making a finding. And so, that's sometimes, these are some of the factors that people don't always hear about. And whenever we made findings, it was after doing extensive research and communication and stakeholder outreach, talking to hundreds of officers in the street, talking to community members and the like. That's why these things sometimes took, anywhere from, I think it was 8 months in Ferguson to 18 months in Baltimore to come to when we reached findings. On the depolicing question, I just think that we have to be mindful of the fact that there still has not been data to back up some of these issues. I think it's important that people hear directly from line officers about what they are experiencing, and
so
obviously.
I'm sorry to interrupt. So you're saying no data to back up depolicing, the Ferguson effect or the Baltimore effect?
Well, yeah, I mean, I haven't seen, and this was one of the criticisms. I remember speaking with Jim and several folks after Director Comey had made the initial set of remarks around the Ferguson effect, which is, if it's true, it's a real concern. It's just that there wasn't data to back that up, and we need to understand that and understand what the local conditions are. I think it's a mistake to just jump to the conclusion that it's because of scrutiny that police officers may be unwilling to rush out of their cars. I think police officers every day are running into danger and continue to, and I think all of you in this room represent entities that are doing exactly that, where your officers are doing that. And the thing that I think is dangerous is we don't have the causal impact. When you go into a place like Baltimore, there has been a study, a really powerful study out of Milwaukee, that looked at 911 calls in the aftermath of a very high-profile shooting of an unarmed African-American man that went viral. And it wasn't a shooting, it was a beating, sorry. And the 911 calls went down so dramatically. It was so significant. And so we've got, I mean, there may be multiple causes as to what's happening, but when the community feels like there isn't accountability or there isn't justice for that kind of activity, and the lack of trust in policing or in the department can have a very profound consequence on public safety. And sometimes I think that that's what's, we set these fake binaries up where it's, you're either for public safety or for constitutional policing or best practices in policing. And I think there are any number of departments and chiefs in this room who defy that binary every day, because they're not waiting for the critical incident. They're engaging with their community. They know who the leaders are. They're having conversations about where there are rooms to build and improve and to work together. And over and over again, through the experience of where we sat, there was no question that public trust was a cornerstone for public safety in so many of the communities that we were in.
You talk about accountability. That is, whenever you talk to people in the community, that always comes up. Well, police officers aren't being held accountable for the actions they take. Sheriff Stanek, I saw you shaking your head a little bit. Do you think police officers, law enforcement in general, is being held accountable for the actions they take?
Yeah, well, Jeff, thanks very much for having us here, and to the IACP for having the foresight to put together a panel like this and have these tough discussions amongst law enforcement and the public. Having said that, I agree with some things. I disagree with some things I've heard in the first 15 minutes here this morning. But at the end of the day, if the approval rating for police officers and law enforcement in this country is at 67% or on average around that number, that's a heck of a lot better than other things I see. Now, you talked about depolicing in Ferguson or Baltimore or places in between. Look, I don't know about the Ferguson side, but in Baltimore, it was a lack of support from those elected officials. And I'd venture to say that their approval rating is a lot lower than 67%, has been, will be, moving into the future. Having said that, the accountability piece, absolutely important to law enforcement. We hold our people accountable. We are harder on ourselves than anyone from the public or the outside, and that's the way it should be, through our state licensing boards, through our agency policies and procedures, our internal affairs. But at the end of the day, community policing is just that. It's the standards of the community. No matter what area you come from, whether it's a city or a county, what size or shape badge you wear, whether it's a shield or a star like mine, it doesn't matter. Blue, brown, green, maroon, we're all peace officers at the end of the day. We work for the communities in which we serve.
You talk about that percentage who have confidence. I mean, if you look at the numbers, there are two different stories there. If you're talking to someone who is black or Hispanic, perhaps, they have a different view. And numbers are, generally speaking, maybe half that, right? In Baltimore, in the DOJ report, it talks about two different Baltimores. One wealthy, one lower income, and they have two different views of police. So the numbers don't always tell the full story. And oftentimes, you are going into these neighborhoods, Chief Thompson, where people in the community look at police, they don't have that 57% confidence in police. It's the numbers down here. So how do you counter that? How do you change the perception in Camden?
So, my city is 96% minority. We're in cities of 50,000 or more, we're the poorest in the country. We have a per capita income of $13,000 a year. We had, for decades, had very high levels of mistrust between the community and its police. And to be quite frank with you, having been there for 2.5 decades, some of it was well earned on our part. And it was incumbent upon us to reverse that. Now, one of the things that we have taken and embraced as an organization is that although none of us, and this is what I'll say to my officers when we're conducting training and the like, which which, by the way, really underscores a lot of the pattern and practice deficiencies, is the cutting and training of officers that can better prepare them to handle situations and to avoid unconstitutional policing. But one of the things that I will say to my officers is to understand the context that we are going to be thrusted into ambiguous situations that are rapidly unfolding, and oftentimes the people that are there are not going to want to see us there. And we have to understand that although none of us were standing on the other side of the Edmund Pettus Bridge 40 some odd years ago, we may not be responsible for what occurred there, but we're responsible to it. And it's something that we just need to be aware of when we're dealing with our community, particularly our minority community, is that there are still people alive, grandparents and the like, that can tell their grandchildren about what it was like to live during the Jim Crow era, and that we were the enforcers of that. It is a reality, painful reality, that we have to come to terms with.
That sounds a lot like what Terry Cunningham said, right? With the apology.
Exactly. And it's...
So you believe that too? You believe that because of the history there, you have to confront the issue with people in the community, acknowledge the past, and then move forward?
I know there are members of my community that have a preconceived notion when we show up that we are not there to help. And the only way we can change that is through human contact and experience. And it's not going to be a police chief standing up and giving a speech. It's going to be one of the thousands of little interactions that are positive. You know, when we look at a lot of the issues that cause flashpoints in communities, it's not necessarily the issue in and of itself. It's about the perception of the community of thousands of interactions of inequity that led up to that moment in time. So it's, you know, the patrolman on the beat is far more influential than the individual sitting in the corner office with stars on his collar. And when our officers are properly trained and they're equipped and they're resourced and they can get out there and we provide them the time to have those positive contacts with the community, the peace dividend return is significant.
Jim, how do you respond to that? What does your membership think about confronting the history, acknowledging that there is a history there, and trying to move forward?
Well, obviously, there's nothing that any of us can do to change the past. And the vast majority of us, at least those who are still active in policing, weren't involved in those practices. We acknowledge them, certainly. We know that it happened. We regret profoundly that it happened. But we see our responsibility is not to take responsibility for what happened then, but rather to take responsibility for what happens going forward and to try to work to get it right, to do the right things for the community and with the community, and that's an important element of this, is working with the community, and I think that was mentioned at the outset. We think and understand that two observations not directly related to this. One is that I went to Catholic schools, and I know the troublemaker was always seated next to the teacher. So here I am. and the other is that I know Vanita was a little apprehensive about coming. So I know that Vince Tolucci, ever the diplomat and wanting Vanita here very badly, thought he'd get somebody here who was going to be less welcome than she was. So she feels good about it. But in any event, the Fraternal Order of Police, we are the largest police union, but there are a number of them. Police are contrarians and independents, so while we're the largest union, we only represent about 45% or so of all the police officers in the United States. But we feel like we're of a mind with them, and our thinking is that we would like to see, and we would like to work with management, and this is something we've discussed in a preliminary way with the IACP on recruiting, because we think recruiting is an extraordinarily important aspect of changing the culture in policing. We need more diversity. We need more minorities. We need more women in law enforcement. And the only way to get that is through good, solid recruiting. And it's not just women and not just minorities, but the right ones, good people, good, solid people who are going to do a good job and invest in the job. And as a union, any union, we don't really have any authority to say that management decides who our members are by who they hire. We don't hire, we don't recruit, we don't train anybody. But as their elected representative, it falls to us to represent them when things go bad. And nobody hates a bad cop more than a good cop does, and that's at every level. And we want to see the profession viewed not just by the 67%, and maybe that's a skewed number, maybe it isn't. We'd like to see it 87, 97. But the only way to do that is for us not only to do our jobs better, but have the perception of how we're doing our jobs improved. And we'll only do that as we look more like the community and do our jobs in a way that's more accepted by the community. But we've got to keep doing those jobs. We've got to keep doing the same kinds of things that'll keep crime out of a community. And when bad people have to be arrested, it's never going to be pretty. And that cell phone or whatever its successor is 20 years from now is always going to be there. But we're going to have to keep doing it. So it's going to be 90% of acceptance is in presentation. And that's what we've got to address, I think, here.
Chief Moss, Ferguson, you stepped into that job at a difficult time. Ferguson, under consent decree, you lack diversity in your police force. You told me when I went to Ferguson and interviewed you, you wanted the police force there to look more like the community. But if, in referring back to this Gallup poll, if you have young people in the community, you only see police a certain way, how do you recruit there? How do you increase diversity if the attitude in the neighborhoods is that, hey, we don't like police?
Well, I think one of the things, and I'm happy to say that Ferguson's a lot more diverse now than it was when I got there. And a lot of that has come from simply going out and having conversations with people. A lot of young people never thought about being police officers, or they hear the back noise that turns them away from policing. But a lot of that continues, if you will, because they don't have conversations. I've talked to people who have applied for the police department because I saw them, I saw the qualities, and I saw that they'd be good for the job. And when I went over and approached them and had that conversation, they applied because they never even thought about it. I think one of the things that is very, very key is you kind of have not because you ask not. And one of the things that we have to do as policing agencies is start to go to some different places. If you're looking for African Americans, why not go to HBCUs and have that conversation? When they have those one-on-one conversations with police officers, when they have those one-on-one interactions that's not you in their rearview mirror with your lights on, it opens up a new world of possibilities. And so we really just have to keep getting out there and doing the job of knocking on doors and getting people to see us as human beings. And when they see that, they see the possibilities. I think that a lot, just by virtue of the fact that I'm the first African American police chief in Ferguson, I think that has opened up the possibility in young people's minds that I too can aspire to be that. And so it's hard work, it's long work, but a lot of it is conversations and approaching and going places that we haven't traditionally gone. Typically when police departments want to hire, they put an ad in the newspaper or they do some radio spots, they may even put up a poster. But if you're not going out and pressing flesh and actually talking to people, it's kind of just not going to do it. And so I think the challenge on police chiefs, I think the challenge on police departments all across the nation is to actually get out and do some non-traditional things to attract people to the job. It can be done. It's just we've got to change our method of thinking.
Last year, this time, the FOP endorsed Donald Trump for president. It was endorsing a different approach to law enforcement. A year later, Chief Thompson, what do you think has changed? And has it changed in a positive way, or have things slid back in terms of police community relations?
Well, look, I think as much like politics, all policing is local, to be quite frank with you. You know, I think some of the language regarding certain issues such as immigration, and particularly in communities like I have, it will cause some strains within that community. You know, for the local police to reassure that immigrant community that regardless of what they may be seeing on social media or hearing on the TV, you know, we are not there to arrest them and deport them. When our folks respond to an emergency, our first question isn't, what is your citizenship? Our question is, what do you need? You know, how can we help you? You know, where is the bad guy? And, you know, it has created some challenges within that community, but to be quite frank with you, you know, rhetoric that comes out of anywhere should never really be able to define a local police organization's relationship with its own community. If they are out there each and every day, their personal contacts is what's going to define it. And I'm sure, as many of the people in this room have experienced, that dynamic that seems to exist wherein people may have, and I know I've experienced this in Camden, that people may have a negative perception nationally about police, but they love their local cop, right? And that is a challenging narrative for us to try to change the dynamic of, because we can't control the media and how the perception that they're constantly feeding it. But here's what we know is that when we have our contact with them, in whatever form it may be, even in a moment of enforcement, if we are applying the principles of procedural justice and we're treating people with respect and dignity, they're more concerned about that than the process than the outcome of it. So I haven't seen anything change, to be quite frank with you, with the administration change in my own community, because I'm not going to allow anyone else to define us to our people other than us and our actions.
Benito, the police officers that I talked to felt during the Obama administration, and really frankly some police chiefs said that we didn't feel like they had our back. So based on what you're seeing now, what is your response to the dramatic changes coming and the messaging from the White House, and how that has changed things on the ground as you see them as someone now outside of DOJ, but as you see them with the knowledge of policing across this country that you have, what type of changes have you seen, and do you see them as positive?
Well, you know, I think the changes out of Washington, or certainly the Justice Department, have been pretty dramatic in terms of, you know, the funding. I mean, it's not just kind of enforcement. There's a lot of money that gets doled out by the Justice Department to state and locals, and they can set priorities around, you know, making immigration enforcement a top priority. You see that in grant solicitations now more and more, and in the bully pulpit. And I think, you know, it was pretty alarming, I think, for a lot of people who had been working for a long time on community police relations and these issues, to have the president kind of laugh at Suffolk County about roughing up suspects as they're putting into the car. But what was, I think, gratifying is that there has been so much tremendous leadership in law enforcement that spoke up, said that those comments were not helpful, and that there are use of force guidelines that they are using and moving forward with. And I think for a lot of people, and this is my impression, is that Washington and kind of the politicization of law enforcement you know, is certainly a serious problem, but because law enforcement and the relationships between communities and police is so fundamentally local, that local leadership is what is going to carry the day. And for a lot of folks, the noise that's coming out of Washington, D.C. Is something obviously to be mindful of, and it has, as I said, there are purse strings attached at times, but it's also that there's tremendous leadership. I look at IACP just hosting this kind of meeting where the conversations are continuing. You look at the agenda for the last several days, and it's been tackling the very tough questions. You could have had the exact same agenda a year ago. In fact, we did. In fact, I remember being on stage having a different set of hard conversations at the time. And I think that's where there's tremendous leadership. But I also think we have to acknowledge that there's a different set of priorities out of this administration. That's the administration's prerogative. It does have an impact. I think it has an impact. You know, there's been a lot of momentum, and I would say particularly in the states, around issues like criminal justice reform. And the states are continuing to lead the way on that. In fact, in some ways, the federal government and the Obama administration was late to that game. There were states, red states, blue states, that had been, you know, doing that kind of work. And that work, you know, we've been talking a lot about policing, but all of us know that the issues around police community tensions, there's a huge backdrop about people's relationships with the government, people's beliefs in whether the criminal justice system operates fairly. The police are often the front lines and the face of that in communities, but in a lot of ways are decisions made by elected officials around divestment in mental health resources, divestment in schools, and a kind of a criminalization model that puts police, you know, at the face of having to have limited tools of arrest and incarceration to address what are fundamentally social problems. And there's been a lack of support, I think, even for police departments to be able to engage in those in ways that protect officers and public safety. And there's been so many social problems put at the feet of police. And so there's this broader ecosystem around, you know, around the context for policing. You look at a place like Baltimore and other cities that couldn't be truer or more stark there. And so, you know, the danger is that we kind of go into tunnel vision and like drop these or feel the pressure is off to really engage in the hard work of building these relationships, having the hard conversations locally about where reform is needed, where there needs to be mutual respect built and mutual humanization and the like. But I remain still optimistic that despite the noise, that there's a lot of momentum, and it's because of folks like you, it's because in this room, it's because of folks like you who are meeting with your communities every day, doing this hard work, and ultimately understanding that, that you can't do the work of creating public safety without the trust of your communities. But it's gonna be hard to continue that as the pressures from the bully pulpit and the purse strings can really change priorities. And I just think, you know, my hope is that people will not let go of some of the important reckoning that's been happening over the last several years.
Yeah, it's really, and you know this, it's remarkable what, and this is what I learned over the last 3 years. You look at the Ferguson report and how police were being asked to be a revenue generator, write tickets. You look at what's happening with mental health, for example, Hennepin County Jail, and you can speak to this, Sheriff Stanek. Police officers are being asked to do more than the job description. I mean, that's what this is coming down to. I talked to Dean Angelo in Chicago, who said, we can't raise your kids, we can't cure your psychosis. And of course, the community has a different view of this. But the reality is, and the fact is, politicians are putting more on police. Immigration, mental health, revenue generation. But let's focus on mental health because you're seeing crisis levels in your jail.
We are. So as a sheriff, like some cities across the country, but all sheriffs operate jails. We book about 40,000 people a year through the front doors. No big surprise. Last year, about this time, we took just one single day, a booking population of about 1,000, asked everybody who came in the front doors through an assessment through our nurses, where they at? About 52% came back with diagnosed, undiagnosed mental health issues, right? No big surprise. Some people say a third. Some people say 2/3. We ended up at about 52%. Now, you are right, as the panel members are as well, about law enforcement, the people in uniform. Again, no matter what color uniform you wear, what size, shape, badge you have on your chest, we are the most visible physical arm of local unit of government. We are called to do everything from A to Z. We're expected to do all of it, succeed at it, yet our training, our experience, not so much. You talk about mental health in particular. I talk about first responders and second responders. I, as a police officer, and all of you are first responders. We get to the scene, we stabilize the scene, we try and move individuals along. Is my job to cure all ills of society? Not so much. We would like to, but that's just not what the first responders were built for. And so we rely on second responders, and they don't get a free pass in this. Second responders like education and healthcare and civic groups and businesses, they've got to step up as well. It is an interesting dynamic to try and merge the two together, but at the end of the day, it has to happen. Scott said it eloquently. All politics are local. All policing is local. What we do in our communities reflect our community's priorities, not dictated by Washington, not dictated by some federal agency or somewhere else, but rather what happens in our local communities. The chief or the sheriff, the chief by appointment, the sheriff by election, stand on those priorities in their community and reflective of what that community wants and expects from their police.
The opioid crisis. Chief Thompson, you were telling me last week that in one 4-hour period, 14 overdose deaths. 14. How do you handle that?
So we had, they weren't deaths, we had 14 overdoses in a 14-hour period. In a city of 77,000, we have just hit our 80th homicide, which puts us at a total, 80th overdose death, which puts us at the equivalent of 16 and 15 combined. Much like mental health, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here, it is another social issue that is being neatly placed at our feet that we are ill-trained, ill-prepared to handle. It's the delegation of the public health crisis of the opioid addiction is not going to be fixed unilaterally by giving cops Narcan, just like the mental health issue is not going to be fixed by giving officers CIT training. These are Band-Aids to arterial bleeding. And the frustration is that the demands that are being placed upon police from, in trying to build relationships with our community. Look, we want our cops out in the community engaging with people. That's what cops want to do. But unfortunately, a significant portion of our day is now being required to respond to homelessness that are creating disturbances in areas because there's not social services. They've been cut politically for the funding to properly handle. The opioid crisis, which now there's points in time that we don't even, our ambulance crews can't even keep up with the volume, and we're pulling officers off of cops' calls for service to handle that. Now look, preservation of life is our highest priority, and we are going to save as many lives as we can in the opportunity that's presented to us. But there has to be a managing of the expectation that the public has upon what the men and women who are just human beings wearing this blue uniform are able to perform.
So when you're dedicating resources to the opioid crisis, what suffers? Are your crime numbers going up? Where are you lacking resources that is hurting the community?
Well, I mean, you're talking about every time, so I have an extremely challenged community. I have destabilized neighborhoods. And the presence of a guardian figure is often the determining factor of something really bad happening or not. And the fact that we got to pull that guardian figure out of having a positive contact with the community to deal with public health issues is a delegation of a responsibility that's not really equitable. We're there, we can provide help when it needs to be, but I don't think that there has been a serious enough effort to, look, even our Narcan now, with the strains of fentanyl that are coming in and the potency of it, we're starting to even see our Narcan needing 2 and 3 and 4 doses to revive people and bring them back to life.
So the initial dose isn't working?
We have seen that, yes. And when you look at the rate of the deaths that have occurred over the last several years, they're growing exponentially. We have far more people, 65,000 people died last year of opioid overdoses. I mean, we've eclipsed the amount of people that are dying of opioid overdoses that are dying in motor vehicle accidents on our highways.
Chief Moss, are you seeing this in Ferguson too?
We've seen an uptick, yes, and I mean
Uptick
in actually having to use Narcan. Actually, we started issuing it to our department not long ago because we are seeing cases where people have been using drugs, are in respiratory or other distress, and we're having to respond to that. And one of the issues, and I agree with the chief wholeheartedly, we can respond and initially stabilize the situation, but there has to be a lot more on the back end to deal with this as a crisis, because let's face it, like with mental health, a psychologist goes to school for years. A police officer gets a 40-hour course. With the opioid crisis, there are not enough treatment centers. There's not enough prevention, and so police are having to deal with that, and that is a drain on our resources. That is putting us in the middle of a fight that we're not equipped to handle.
So this is a question for both Jim and Vanita. When you were at DOJ, in these meetings, when you were leading the Civil Rights Division, were there discussions about, well, how do we take some of the pressure off police?
Yeah, I mean, we often were having conversations with not just chiefs, but rank and file officers during the course of investigations, and hearing very, acute stories of the amount of pressures and the lack of attention to officer safety and wellness over the long term, the stresses of the job.
What were they saying?
We would hear often about the fact that there was no services for officers after they had been in a pretty traumatic encounter, or they were just expected to show up to work the next day and get to work. There was an inability to access or acknowledge the need for programs and services for officers who had been encountering a lot of stress on the jobs. There was sometimes, in Ferguson, Chief Moss and I were just talking about this, the pay for officers was so low and wasn't allowing for, sometimes there was a need to have secondary employment on top of the stress of doing those jobs, and trying to take that seriously and looking at that. Looking at other kinds of training and opportunities where training was sometimes the first thing that got cut, and yet the expectations on officers were higher and higher. I think all of those things, we heard about those issues repeatedly, and also this notion that officers were being blamed for a lot of decisions made by elected officials, both in criminal justice policy making and in broader policy making that we've been talking about. I mean, you look at Ferguson, when we were doing the investigation, Ferguson had things like officers had basically become debt collectors. They hadn't signed up for the force to become debt collectors, but they were issuing fines of, I'm going to get the number slightly off, so don't quote me on it, but literally something like, $250 for jaywalking, $497, this one I remember, for having high weeds and grass on your lawn. And then the municipal court was open for half a day, twice a week. The days would shift. Nobody had notice of it. And so you had African-American residents accumulating these debts, trying to pay them, getting incredibly and deeply resentful. The police department was basically, and the city was funding their local court system off of the backs of pretty low-income African-American residents in Ferguson. And so the level of resentment and anger towards government and the police department existed long before Michael Brown was killed in the street, and I think it really kind of came to a fore. But to be able to address some of those broader issues and to deal with it, we heard from officers in Ferguson that told us about those issues and said, we didn't sign up to become police officers to collect money. That's not what we signed up for the force for. So I think there's a lot of issues here. I will say, though, also, and I want to pick up a point that was made, about there's also a need for in terms of officer wellness and safety, for officers to feel like there's fair internal accountability systems when something goes wrong. And that was often sometimes, those were things also that contributed to low morale, where there were arbitrary decisions being made about when an officer would get disciplined and when an officer wouldn't. And for communities, this concern about the lack of accountability, I think, is real. We're seeing that, I think, right now play out in really real ways. I think there's a lot of concern and anger, frankly, about the lack of accountability when an unarmed black man gets shot. And there's a lot of reasons for it, and that's a whole bunch of work that we can talk about. I heard it as a prosecutor for the federal government with our very high bar for that. But it was one of those common things that we heard from officers and community members about, this arbitrary decision-making around discipline when there's accountability and when there isn't. And it affects morale internal to the department, and it certainly affects the way that communities perceive how law enforcement is operating. And I will say what's interesting to me is that this is where there has to be a lot of focus on prosecutors, and because I think a lot of chiefs have really taken it up and are taking action when there are bad incidents. But it really does impact the perceptions and the reality, both internal to the department and outside.
Yeah, let's go back to accountability, because this is something that you and I talked about. When you have these big cases where the public sees a police officer who shot an unarmed black man being acquitted, they can't figure out why that's happening. So, Jim, I wanted to ask you, because you have said, despite what the court system is doing, some police departments are moving with administrative action. Is that what's happening in some of the police departments that you've seen?
It has happened, yes, around the country, and I think, police officers don't check their civil rights at the door, at the station house door. They're still citizens with the same basic due process rights as any other citizen has. And when they are accused of a crime or being investigated for a crime, no matter how egregious, they still deserve the same. Go ahead.
But there are people in the community who don't agree with that. They say, police officers get a break. We don't get the breaks. Because they see it on video, and they see what looks to them like a crime occurring, and then they hear that someone has been cleared.
We don't ask for breaks, we ask for equity. And you can't discard the possibility when an officer is acquitted that he was innocent. That's always there.
And so what about these police chiefs who are taking administrative actions instead? Is that a way of calming public sentiment, Sheriff Stanek?
Well, since 2014 with Ferguson, there have been 3 fatal shootings like that in Hennepin County, Minneapolis area. The first was Jamar Clark. No charges in that case, unarmed black male. The second was Philando Castile and the St. Anthony Police. He was charged. He was acquitted by a jury. The third one, just in the last few months, a woman named Justine Dumond. The investigation is pending now at the county attorney's office for consideration of criminal charges. You had one that was charged, one that wasn't charged, you've got one pending. And we've had other fatal encounters involving law enforcement since that time. Some get a lot of publicity and coverage, others do not. I don't know at the end of the day, like I said, I think all police chiefs and sheriffs in this country, those chief law enforcement officers, want accountability for actions by their officers, and they will take the appropriate actions to do so. And again, there's also the state licensing boards across this country. But at the end of the day, I think that what we do as chief law enforcement officers is going to, again, be reflective of the communities in which we serve. And I know folks are not going to agree with that. There are many segments of the community that don't like to see or have a notion in play that no matter what the outcome is, whether charged, not charged, acquitted, or found guilty, that'll be it at the end of the day. Now, one thing we haven't talked about, honestly, Jeff, is the incessant 24/7 news cycle.
We can talk about that.
You heard me.
We can talk about
24/7 incessant news cycle and how it pushes information out there all hours of the day and night, 24/7, social media, TV, print, electronic, it doesn't matter. Sometimes the story gets out there long before the facts are known, and perceptions are created in the community, which are really tough for Scott and myself and all of you in the audience to overcome.
But that's why transparency is so important these days, right? To move quickly, to take some sort of decisive action. That's why it's important.
Transparency is important, but so are the facts. And as Jim said, representing the largest union in this country, those officers are entitled to their constitutional rights, just like when we have protests. And every day in our communities across this country, there are protests. Our job as peace officers is not just to uphold their constitutional rights and personal liberties, but also to protect them so they can exercise them under the First Amendment. And we do so walking that fine line every single day.
We're going to open it up to questions in about 5 minutes. Chief Moss, we started with you. You took this very difficult job in Ferguson. How have you been able to change that department? Recruiting, are your numbers up? You still having a problem recruiting, especially diversity? How have you been able to change the department?
Well, one of the things that we did was we sort of changed our approach to how we recruit. We're actually out looking for people. I mean, we're not just putting an ad in the paper. We're not just putting an ad in the newspaper. We're actually out having conversations and engaging people and determining, or at least offering the job to people that we feel are right for the job. And one of the things that, one of the things that has been a change with regard to how we hire is that we're looking a lot more at the character of people than just the skill set. Because you can train the head, but you can't train the heart. And so even the types of questions we're asking when we're interviewing police officers, when's the last time you did something for someone in a community and you didn't expect anything back? We're looking for compassion. We're looking for people with an eye toward service. And so, we've managed to change that. And as that has started to happen in our practice, people have been more receptive to the Ferguson Police Department and are seeing it as a possible place to start a career. And so far, it's been pretty successful, and I'd like to think that it's going to continue to be.
How important is vetting in this atmosphere? I've talked to police chiefs who say that is maybe the most important thing you can do. There has been some talk about easing the requirements to bring up the numbers. So how important is vetting? Chief Thompson.
I couldn't hear your question, I'm sorry. How important
is the vetting process? Has it, have you increased the requirements? Is it harder to become a police officer these days? The screening process.
Well, I don't think it's so much and I don't think that we should ever lower a standard, right? I mean, at the end of the day, we're talking about a lot of these critical issues are born out of the fact that we are empowering people, the only people in our democracy, to use force upon its citizenry, up to deadly force. And we should be held to the highest standards, and we should be able to recruit, and I know Jim will agree with this, and pay to the level of competency that which this society and our republic expects. But we are definitely dealing with a perception issue in recruitment and getting people to come on board under the, I mean, think of what we're asking young men and women to come into at this point in time, particularly under a microscope whose magnification has grown exponentially. And, there has been, in some instances, an unjust vilification of officers. And I know that is a sense of many of the rank and file as well. And we're asking people to join us in this community. And there are still many that are willing to do so, that are highly qualified. And, you know, I truly believe that we're going to get through this. And this is going to be done because of the leadership in this room, the leadership of the folks sitting in the front row over here, to ensure that we are constantly progressing and moving in a direction that is going to professionalize us to the highest level. Today's cops are far better than yesterday's cops. I don't know if I could get in a squad car and do what our folks do out there each and every day. I never had to do it in that type of environment. I am in all of them. But the numbers have decreased in the amount of people that come on. We do see a higher level of attrition, and we're not.
You do see a high level of attrition.
Yeah, and I also think some of that's generational. With you have a millennial generation now that will have 3 or 4 careers prior to settling down into one. You know, it was unheard of 25 years ago for people to go into police work and leave it to go into another profession. It was a vocation. And some of that is the narrative that we need to change. And some of it is that we need to change to that narrative. So it's striking that balance. But we're not broken. Do we need repair? Yeah. Can we be finely tuned? Absolutely. Is there a better way to do this? Undoubtedly. But we're not fractured as a vocation.
Sheriff Stanek, what do you counsel young officers coming onto your department?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I bet if you turn around and ask your audience, how many of you are getting the number and flow of applicants you want every day for the jobs that you have available, and they'd all raise their hands, or the vast majority of them, that we are not seeing the applicants that we saw several years ago for a host of reasons, as we've discussed here over the last hour. I would also say that, I'm not interested in changing the hiring standards or the requirements for peace officers coming in to our job or our profession. What I tell young people when they come on the job, when I interview them, when I have a chance to talk with them at the recruit academies, is talk about the badge, the honor, the integrity. Compassion, dignity, respect are the orders of the day in my sheriff's office, and I'd venture to say in the vast majority of the agencies represented in this room. We talk about how tough it is, whether they work in a jail environment or they work patrol, the crime lab, civil, warrants, you name it. In compassion, dignity, respect, they are inevitably going to have contact if they're working with the community, with friends, neighbors, relatives, high school, whatever it might be, and you want to treat them with the respect that they deserve and expect from their local law enforcement agency.
All right, so on that note, we're going to move. We've had 60 minutes of this discussion. We're going to move into the Q&A. And keep in mind, these are the questions that you sent in electronically. The first one, it was stated that good cops hate bad cops. This being said, why is the police community silent when wrongdoing is presented in the media and it is apparent the officer acted improperly or illegally, such as the case where the South Carolina officer shot the fleeing man in the back? That was the Walter Scott case in North Charleston. Who wants to handle that? Jim?
I'm the one that said it. I think that taking that example, but just using it universally and getting back to what I said earlier, respecting the due process rights of all officers, just as we are required to respect the due process rights of all citizens, and hopefully do in every instance. We can't be prejudging an individual, notwithstanding what the evidence against that individual might be, whether that's a police officer or a school teacher or a priest or a truck driver. And we did not make any statements in support of that police officer, nor did we make any statements in opposition, because the process had not been completed. And that's our policy. And that's the way it should be.
Okay. Benita, you were in the Civil Rights Division at that time. What is your reaction to how that case ended up?
Well, I mean, it gets back to the accountability issues. I was at the Justice Department when we charged that case, and there are a lot of reasons why people in, particularly I think the Black community, feel like it's just impossible to get justice and accountability, even in some of the most stark cases. And some of that is about a concern about district attorneys being too close to police agencies and not being willing to take an independent lens to indict. Sometimes it's about juries and jury bias that we all share, implicit bias around kind of because of the overcriminalization, perceived overcriminalization of African American men in a case like Philando Castile or a case like Walter Scott, about like how can, even with the facts and the video and everything else, that it just feels like justice is unreachable. And it really, I think right now, I can't put too fine a point on how profound the impact is of this perception of lack of ability to have justice in those cases, the impact that that has on police-community relations and on perceptions of police in communities of color. It's profound, and it's particularly, I think, playing itself out in really important ways. But I don't think that there's one kind of body to blame. I think it's not. It's the courts have a role in kind of how they've interpreted the Fourth Amendment, and but the juries have a role as well. There's district attorneys and prosecutors. There are federal laws and things like that. But it is a mistake to sweep under the rug just how profound an impact that particular issue is having right now on policing in communities of color. And again, it's not necessarily in the control of folks in this room, because there's administrative actions and that's one thing, but it is, I think there's a real sense that the criminal justice system operates swiftly to incarcerate and sentence Black men to enormously long prison terms, often for even nonviolent offenses. But the inability to have justice is for officer-involved shootings that are caught on video, like Walter Scott. Again, the one thing I will, though, say is, having been a prosecutor on this, is a lot of times there are narratives where people are absolutely 100% convinced that they know exactly what happened. And it turns out that once you do a thorough investigation and you talk to a lot of folks and you do what you need to do to either make the case or decline, and we have to be careful about that. And everyone has due process rights, but this is a profound issue playing itself out right now in this country, and we can't deny the significance of it.
All right, we've gotten dozens of questions here. I'm trying to go through them
Jeff,
on this
there's a question for you on the teleprompter.
I know.
He's avoiding that one.
Well, let me ask it for
All
you.
right, fine. You go ahead, Sheriff Stanek, and ask me that question.
It says, Jeff, would you comment on the media's role in portraying the police side of the Black and Blue stories on air?
See, I couldn't have asked myself that question. It sounds better coming from you. Listen, I think you talked about the news cycle and how fast it changes, and we in news struggle with that too. I mean, when I was 25 years ago, when I started out in this business, we had a typewriter and a pager, and I had to stop at a payphone to call in. So the world has changed, and it seems to change every year in terms of how we are covering you. And on this issue, I think we try, at least at CBS News, to paint a balanced picture. We try. But I know throughout the news landscape that doesn't always happen. Some of that is incumbent on you. I tell people all the time when I deliver speeches about my book that when I look at Twitter feeds and I see police officers delivering turkeys, or some officer in DC dancing with some kid in the neighborhood, it may sound corny, but those images sell. People like to see that. And all of that breaks down these barriers between Black and Blue. When we're showing those images on TV, people in the community, they see that and they see a different side of policing. So as much as that, whether there's a Walter Scott type story or something else, it's incumbent, I think, on police departments to promote the good that is happening, that your officers are doing. We did a story last week about local police and federal agents partnering on sex trafficking. It's a tough discussion, But the agents and the officers that we interviewed, I was struck by, that's a tough job, but I was struck by how they felt they were really helping these girls and these kids and what kind of difference that made in their lives. And I think when people see stories like that, police officers going out there every day to rescue people, that sticks with them too. Just like the negative images stick with them, that sticks with them too. And ultimately, that might be the story that convinces this young kid in West Baltimore or East Baltimore to grow up and be the next Delrish Moss. And so that's important. Thanks for the question.
Thank you.
All right. There have been so many issues laid at the feet of the police. What do you see as the #1 criminal justice reform issue? Who wants that one?
Well, I'll take one part of it.
Okay.
One part from from a sheriff's perspective. And that is, I'll just tell you a quick story about a guy named Garrett. Garrett's an 18-year-old black male who lives in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota, a suburb just north of Minneapolis within Hennepin County. Garrett came into jail on September 1st. He was arrested by local police for identity theft. Not the most horrendous, violent, heinous crime out there, but nonetheless, he was arrested on September 1st. He stayed in jail until September 5th, 4 days later, after the Labor Day holiday, and then released, no criminal charges. And we had to ask, how could this guy spend 4 days in jail, never be charged out with the crime? Isn't that symptomatic or a part of what happens in the criminal justice system? And I'd argue that, yes, it is. As law enforcement officers, we're out there 24/7, 7 days a week, every single days of the year, holidays included, enforcing the laws, protecting our public and community. Yet other aspects, this goes from the first responders to the second responders, other aspects of the criminal justice system, not so much. Like in my county, my courts are open from 8 a.m. until 4, maybe 4:30 p.m., right? They're not there on the weekends. They're not there on the holidays, which is why Garrett stayed in jail from Friday afternoon until Monday evening when he was released. And it's just not fair. It's not the way it should be. When you talk about criminal justice reform, there are simple things we can do that make sense every day. Those courts could work a night shift, and I know there are parts of this country where they do so, but in my county, in my community, that's what we're going to continue to push for as one aspect of it from a sheriff.
I want to ask Jim about that because, in Washington, it's hard to find common ground. And that was the one issue where it seemed everybody was in agreement until, 10 months ago? Criminal justice reform. When you have discussions with people on the Hill, does that come up anymore? Is that nobody talks about it anymore?
It still comes up, but the real impetus, although someone mentioned that perhaps the Obama administration had been a little late to the game, the real impetus for our involvement in discussions of criminal justice reform came from the Obama administration. And they were very active on it. I know in my last meeting with General Holder before he left, it was on a Thursday, the subject of that meeting was criminal justice reform. He was still on that case, and he is to this day. Deputy Attorney General Yates picked up that mantle and pursued it till the day she was somewhat unceremoniously shown the door. So there's never been a day when we weren't willing to discuss it. Do we agree on all elements of the proposals that are out there? Obviously not. I don't think there's consensus among the proponents. But we agree that it's something that should be looked at. We don't think that anybody should be in jail for longer than the crime which they committed dictates. And we don't believe any innocent person should be in jail, period. And so, and I think we can all work from those premises. And if we do, and if we enter into it in good faith, we may be able to come to a consensus that certainly nobody's going to get 100% of what they want, but there's room for talk and there's room for improving the system. And we want to be part of the process, and we're more than willing to do so.
Jim Garrett spent 4 days in jail because it was an inconvenience, because the courts weren't open, right? I mean, we talk about it. There are simple things that we can do in criminal justice reform, and this conversation should not have ended and continues. We were just out in D.C. on Tuesday, Wednesday with the law enforcement leaders group, Ron Surpass and others. We had a good, candid conversation. Eric Holder was there, Sally Yates was there, and others. Police chiefs and sheriffs on both sides of the aisle, because, again, this is a nonpartisan issue. It's about what's right for our communities.
Benita?
No, I think that, and I was really heartened to see that meeting happen, and I think that the group of law enforcement officials that are continuing to speak up and for criminal justice reform is so important. I also, though, think we should just acknowledge that there are different pressures coming out of this Justice Department that would have us return to some of the former policies, but I think that there's a lot of ways in which that is an isolated view, even among members of Congress in Washington from both sides, where there's been a number of pieces of legislation introduced in the last several weeks to promote criminal justice reform. I just don't think we can ignore the elephant in the room, which is that we've got a different Attorney General with different views on that. But I think, again, I'm heartened to see that the right and the left is coming together in state legislatures around the country. I'm, probably a little less optimistic about seeing federal criminal justice reform right now, but I think that we have to continue to push to do the right thing. And frankly, when you have the right and the left and law enforcement speaking out about sensible, smart reforms that both protect public safety but are fairer and result in fewer people having their lives, derailed through the criminal justice system, I think that that's a really important thing to keep alive, and so we've got to keep that conversation going.
And Vanita's right, and the Congress has become somewhat more energized than is lately typically the case on criminal justice reform.
Recently?
Recently. We met, my boss and I, with the leadership of the Congressional Black Caucus just 2 weeks ago. An extended meeting along with the leadership of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives.
But is it just, the CBC, or is it other?
No, let me go on.
Okay.
Well, and
But we've also met with Senator Lee of Utah,
Yeah.
and others on the very conservative, if you will, Republican side, and it comes from them. In the Judiciary Committee, you've got Senator Leahy and Senator Paul working together. One of the most unlikely duos I think you'd agree you'd ever find in Congress. So it's not a partisan issue. It's an issue with people, for various reasons, trying to get to the same place if they can, and we're willing to talk to all of them.
All right, so on to the next question. We have time for one more. What do you think the NFL players expect to accomplish by taking a knee during the national anthem? Who wants to take that one? We can go, Jim. Go ahead.
It certainly is their right. It's their First Amendment right to express themselves, and it's our responsibility as law enforcement officers, to whatever extent that right is threatened, to protect them while they exercise it. A large proportion of our membership disagrees with that exercise, but the disagreement is also a First Amendment right, which they're entitled to. So while we may disagree, we honor their right to do it, and it all gets back to, we've got a broken relationship here, and between police and the minority community. The relationship needs, we can't afford a divorce. Neither party can. So we've got to find a way to reconcile here. And I think it's going to go to things, tried and true things, like community-oriented policing, like, as I said earlier, recruiting, getting a more reflective representation in law enforcement of the communities that they serve. The whole broad range of things that are going to make the community and the police who protect them more unified not only in their appearance and their attitude, but in their goals and in their satisfaction with the end product. So
That was a nice positive note.
that's what I'm noted for.
All right,
Jeff, if I might, I just wanted to touch on one other thing.
go ahead.
Yeah, one of the things that came up earlier, and it's just kind of been sticking with me, is when we started to talk about diversification of police departments, one of the things that came up is the question of, do we have to lower our standards? And invariably, when this conversation comes up, that comes up. And you look in this room, you've got African Americans, you've got women, you've got people who are of Hispanic origin, you've got all these people who are qualified, and they weren't that hard to find. And so it just irks me when that comes up, because what it starts to speak about, what it speaks to is a sort of laziness on the part of people with regard to recruiting. I think that, again, getting out and having conversations and finding ways to attract people who don't necessarily fit the bill, if you will, with regard to law enforcement is very important. Fortune 500 companies do it. Retailers do it. There are a lot of qualified people who are not necessarily, that aren't white males. And we've got to get away from the notion that somehow standards have to be lowered in order to bring African Americans or women or people of other ethnic origins on, because there are qualifications running rampant through all of those circles. We've just got to do a better job and stop being lazy about it to recruit them.
Jeff, let me just take one whack at it.
Sure.
For the record, I do not like that they take a knee during the national anthem. I think it is disrespectful. But having said that, I understand. If they want to be agents of change, meaning the NFL players, well, then be agents of change. Our associations have reached out to the NFL and asked them, well, then come work with us in our communities. Come facilitate and have those candid discussions with us. Use the star power and be the agents of change that some of them want to be in working with our communities. We're going to be hosting the Super Bowl here in a few months. Hopefully the Vikings will be in it. Maybe yes, maybe no.
Anything's possible.
Or
Anything's
maybe,
possible, Jim
maybe
said.
the Eagles after last night.
But either way, be the agents of change. Come out and join us as police officers. I'm sorry, Commissioner, I knew that was directed at you. We just want to try and have these discussions, and we'll take it from wherever we can get it in order to have an audience and to have partners that are willing to have the tough conversations like IACP and you arranged for us here this morning.
Go ahead.
The thing that I just worry about is that when the NFL players who were taking a knee get painted as unpatriotic, I think that actually the protest is a deeply patriotic thing that they are doing for the love of their country, because they believe that the issues that they are concerned about, which are about police violence and the lack of accountability that we were talking about when around the killings of unarmed black men, and sometimes that gets lost in the noise because then this gets politicized and everything else. That I just think it's important to remember that there's a long history in this country of athletes, engaging in protests or losing their platform and exercising their First Amendment rights. I agree. I think a lot of those players actually are engaged in conversations in their communities around these issues, and hopefully it's not just taking a knee and engaging in a protest. It goes beyond to kind of doing constructive action, and I know a lot of the players are doing that and are seeking for greater opportunities, but I think it is a real error. It's what makes this country so great, is that we have the First Amendment and that there are people who are willing to stand up for the First Amendment, even in the most unpopular of circumstances at times, because they love their country and believe in its promise and want it to be better. So.
Okay. Anyone else want to comment on players kneeling? Okay. Well, let's end on a positive note, right? Let's talk about, quickly, we have, maybe a minute or less each, something positive going forward that you see developing in your police departments and policing as a whole. Chief Moss.
Something positive. No, actually, I think one of the things I've seen positive in law enforcement is the fact that we are having these conversations, that we're challenging notions, and we're actually stepping up and trying to solve some of the critical issues that the rest of society, if you will, are grappling with. You know, the IACP is a great organization because it's right out at the fore of tackling these by putting on panels like this. And Terry's statement last year, I thought, was a very courageous thing, and I think that portends well for the future, because we're acknowledging things, and if you acknowledge things, you can tackle them and move in a good direction, and so that leads to a brighter future.
Anita.
I think this whole conference is what gives me hope, and it gets back to something that I said, which is that, you know, these are really incredibly tough issues. They're challenging. It's a lot easier to not deal with them than to deal with them. But you look at the agenda for the IACP conference, you look at the leadership, you look at what Terry Cunningham spoke about last year, but what all of you in this room are daily reckoning with and talking about. And to me, that's what gives me optimism, is I think that it's really important for law enforcement leadership to be having these conversations, and that there are folks in the community who also feel a responsibility to have these conversations in constructive ways. That's where I get tremendous hope, and I am really appreciative to the IACP for both hosting this panel, but also for setting an agenda and a conversation on a host of issues, from procedural justice to officer wellness and support, to body cameras and the like, to have a range of conversations that really go to the heart of some of the issues we've been talking about.
I know that we live in the greatest country in the world. We've got the strongest democracy. When we were enlightened several years ago that some of the progress that we have made over the last 30 years may not have been as much as we would have liked, particularly with our minority community, I think that the leadership that is in this room and across this country has been committed to changing in a positive and progressive way, particularly with the noblest men and women that we have underneath of us that are out there each and every day. We're human beings at the end of the day. We're going to be far from perfect, but I did not see an industry that circled its wagons and refused to listen. Some may think that it's taken us more time than it probably should have. Some may be right, some may not. But I believe that there are enough progressive leaders to help shepherd this industry, this vocation, into the 21st century. And I'm remaining extremely optimistic.
I think our profound differences and the complex challenges that all of us face every single day is what gives all of us that optimism. And we herald the brave men and women who serve in our ranks across this country every single day. And they're moms and dads and aunts and uncles and brothers and sisters of everyone. But at the end of the day, they do so for love of service to their community, love of service for profession they chose. They could do many other things. We talked about, folks moving on because of attrition or different jobs within their career. But at the end of the day, it's about love of service. It's what keeps me going every day, and I'd venture to say most of the folks joining us here this morning.
Jim?
Well, I retired from ATF in 1995. I suspect there are some here who hadn't entered the policing profession in 1995. And retired to take this job with the Fraternal Order of Police. I said I'd do it for 3 years, but I'm having a hard time with my exit strategy, apparently. Still here. One of the reasons I'm here, though, is because I could see within the Fraternal Order of Police tremendous potential to not just fulfill its role as a traditional union, which I believe it does very well, but to be an agent, forward-looking agent for change in policing. And I have tried to the extent that I could, working with 4 presidents at this point, to kind of foster that strategy. And over the last few years, and God, it pains me to say this, but I have to give a lot of credit to Vince Tolucci and Terry Cunningham, because with their ascendancy within the IACP, we've found a tremendous working partner. And there's always going to be a dynamic tension between police, labor, and management, and there should be. You know, we've got different interests and we represent different constituencies. But we're all in it for the same reason. We're all in it, as you just said, Sheriff Stanek, because we love the profession, we love the jobs, and we want to make a difference in our communities. And we can, if we work together, have the synergy that we'd never have otherwise to do this job even better. We worked together with IACP. It was really historic from our standpoint. We don't tend to partner up. We worked with the IACP on fine-tuning and improving and presenting better the use of force policies for best practices for use of force policies for departments and agencies nationwide. We're talking now about taking that another step and working on improving policing in, in a much larger perspective in every aspect of policing, and looking at the 21st century policing report as a model and a guidepost for that effort. So I think I'm optimistic overall that we can do better. We're going, our membership, by the way, we're not just a white occupying army in the inner city. Our membership is approximately 30% minority. And our minority community expects that from us, and that's not surprising. What you might find surprising is that our members at large expect that from us. And we're trying to fulfill that expectation for them, and working with the IACP, I see great hope for the future.
Hey, you are known for your positive outlook.
Not generally, but
Oh, okay.
yeah.
Well, thank you for your time. Thank you for your perspectives. Please, a round of applause for our all-star panelists. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Same here. Great shades. Great glasses. Oh, thank you.